Welcome to today's Institute for Supply Management presentation titled The Buying Black Hole, Closing P2P Compliance and Usability Gaps, sponsored by Zycus. It's now my pleasure to introduce your content moderator for today's presentation, John Uva, editor of ISM's member publication, Inside Supply Management. John, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Kurt. I'd like to welcome Jason Bush and Richard Waugh. As Managing Director at Azul Partners, Jason is regarded as one of the leading pundits in the procurement and supply chain marketplace. He serves as executive editor of Spend Matters and is frequently cited by both the business and trade press and blogosphere for his analysis and opinion. His current research interests include the intersection of sourcing and commodity management technologies, supplier management, and supply chain risk management. Richard is Director of Business Development for Zycus. He has an extensive background in B2B e-commerce, going back to his early career at GE, where he helped launch GE's Trading Process Network, the first online marketplace for sourcing and procurement in the mid-1990s. Richard was co-founder of B2E Markets, one of the first SaaS sourcing suite providers. He later covered the supply management market as an industry analyst for the Aberdeen Group. Today's seminar will focus on how next-generation P2P solutions can enable organizations to escape P2P mediocrity, how to ensure full spend coverage and compliance, and how to achieve maximum user adoption. Jason and Richard, welcome to the program.
Thanks, John. It's great to be here. I'm going to get started now. It's an absolute honor to co-present with Richard Waugh. I've known Richard probably going on 12 or 13 years now, since his post-GE days, and Richard is really one of the seminal thinkers around e-procurement and sourcing in the technology world, so it's an honor to co-present alongside him. Just to provide some quick background on Spend Matters, most people know our main site in the procurement sphere, but we also have a very large site covering the metals industry called Metal Miner. It's actually the largest metals trade publication. We also have a site called Spend Matters UK Europe, covering the European market with a major focus on the UK specifically. We'll be expanding next year into some other local languages in Europe. And then we have a site covering the healthcare supply chain, a topic which is a passion of mine, and I think we should devote more to the economy of healthcare versus just political discussions surrounding it, and that's what we try and do on that site. Just to provide a little more background, we also have a research service called Spend Matters Pro. There's 14 people in our organization today, 8 of which are dedicated to examining procurement and related technologies on a full-time basis on the research front, and we all contribute to the Pro site. We do a lot of in-depth analysis of topics such as e-procurement, e-invoicing, supplier networks, guided buying, and related areas. And if you're looking for deeper research than what you might have seen out there from some more incumbent firms, in the research space, would encourage you to check out Pro. We're growing very, very quickly, having just introduced it a few months ago. So with that quick intro, I'm going to talk about the buying black hole, provide some background on where we are in P2P today and how we got there. Excuse the history lesson here if you let me indulge for a few minutes. I think history can be a great guide. And then we're going to look forward and look at how we can approach overcoming some of the early challenges of e-procurement and purchase-to-pay. I'm going to introduce a concept which we've talked about for about a year called surrounding P2P with different approaches and strategies, both if you've got existing implementations you want to get more from, as well as if you're starting from scratch or starting anew. And then I'm going to pass it back to Richard to talk about his view and some of what Zycus is up to in this world of guided buying. I have a little bit of a surprise in between those two sections too, which I think you'll find curious. It ties back to the broader history lesson here as well. So the buying black hole, let's provide some background here very quickly. First-generation purchase-to-pay technologies have existed for quite some time. I can think back personally to the very early days of Commerce One and Ariba and RightWorks and many other providers which I covered as a researcher in the 90s before branching out and getting involved on the vendor side myself and then launching Spend Matters. These things go back a long time. Yet, despite their long history, adoption has been quite low. We're going to talk about that why in a few minutes. But the good news here is that one thing we've seen time and time again is that if we can enable the frontline business user to be more effective in using these tools, we can drive much better adoption and better results, whether we're after compliance, whether we're after reducing spending, whatever our goal is, whether we're after driving spend to diverse suppliers. If we can guide folks to the right decision, they can be much more effective on the front lines of the business in transactional purchasing. But there is a history lesson here. And unfortunately, if we look at where we've come versus where we are today, there's a lot of lessons to be learned, and there have been probably hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, overspent on procurement-related implementations, technology, consultants, systems integrators, without the types of results which could be possible. So having said that, though, manual purchasing is grossly ineffective, and I love this old picture of a librarian from the 30s or 40s looking at the card catalog system. And I have been to various organizations, some big companies who will go unnamed, not so long ago, who still had a card catalog of vendor files, much like this librarian pulling out the file from the archived picture here. So even though we've spent a lot, we've not gotten what we've wanted in certain cases, things have improved. And fortunately, we have moved away from that manual card file. On the next slide, I'm taking what I would just simply describe here as a modified Procure-to-Pay hype cycle. One thing that Gartner Group has done a good job with over the years is tracing the evolution of technologies and how they take off, how they plateau, fall, and rise again. And P2P fits this trough perfectly in terms of where we were a few years ago versus the rise today and what is coming down the line. If we look at why adoption dropped off so dramatically and results in terms of what we could have achieved between 2000 and 2004, many people might remember on this call how organizations thought they could IPO their spend, literally form these consortia, form marketplaces, and literally cash in on their spend because they saw the market caps of I2, of Ariba, of Commerce One. This is what our CFOs were most concerned about back then. They weren't concerned with procurement results. They were getting starry-eyed in terms of the market valuation of these potential exchanges. But fortunately, very quickly, we went through a period where folks started to think about results again. And that's where we turned into 2007, 2009. We saw the adoption of numerous P2P technologies, and today we're seeing faster and faster adoption of both incumbent and solutions from new providers as well. So we are really entering an exciting time for P2P. But if we think back to what happened and why P2P was not as successful as it could have been early on, there's a number of reasons. I'm just going to share a few on this slide. There were numerous initial considerations which we overlooked. For example, how do we go after not just our top 2 or 3 suppliers in given indirect and MRO categories, but how do we enable dozens, potentially even hundreds of suppliers in a catalog system? Many early implementations of SAP SRM, of Oracle E-Business Suite, of PeopleSoft SRM, of Ariba Buyer succeeded, depending on which solution, in enabling a handful, half dozen, dozen suppliers, sometimes more. The good news more recently is we've been much more successful enabling a broader portion of suppliers in P2P systems. Early on, though, if we could get past basic catalog approaches to buying where suppliers could use a catalog, we didn't get very far. So we had lots of challenges with looking at complex services procurement, print as an example, T&E spend, travel spend, lots of challenges there. Also lots of challenges around basic supplier enablement. Things such as onboarding suppliers, content management, so suppliers could self-manage catalog information. But perhaps most important of all, a lot of these initial solutions overlooked the importance of presenting a strong user interface, which somebody could walk up to. My 9-year-old can walk up to Amazon and can order online. Now, that's not always a positive thing, as my bill shows each month. The same on iTunes, which is even a little bit more scary, those random bills I get from kids buying things. But we want our kids on the front lines of our companies to buy as well. Now, we want them to buy effectively, and we want to drive them to the right decisions. But that walk-up experience is key. There were lots of additional challenges as well in the early days. I'm not going to go through all of them here. But a lot of companies did not think about the cost and effort to fully manage supplier information, whether it was basic banking details, other information they had to maintain, such as insurance certifications, supplier diversity certifications, contact information, a whole range of items. And we also didn't necessarily solve for the paper challenge either. Lots of companies implemented e-procurement solutions, but still were mired in paper on the AP side. Just a couple of the challenges we overlooked initially. So we really put the cart before the horse, so to speak. This is one of my favorite stock photos I've probably seen for a decade, but I think it's the unfortunate animal, whether it's a horse or donkey, lifted into the air, is a great metaphor for some of the challenges we have and have faced and continue to face. So we failed to ask the hard questions earlier on. What are we trying to do with these systems? Are we trying to enable the bulk of our spend? Are we trying to gain visibility? Are we trying to steer and guide users to the best decisions? Who's going to take ownership of supplier information, of catalog content, of other data? How do we search across catalogs? How do we search across the web to make sure that we're providing the best sample of information to our users? How do we define success around compliance? And then getting back to the user, again, how will users react to the system? I maintain that any P2P tool which requires significant training, significant meaning more than a few minutes of being able to walk up for that typical frontline buyer, be she a CFO or be he a secretary on the front lines of the business, that person is not necessarily going to use it. They're going to find ways of circumventing spend for a given category if we make it more difficult. So we've got to think about how users will react to the system. That was one thing we didn't do when putting the cart before the horse before. So a few lessons learned from the trenches. Integration and usability upstream, and there's different definitions of upstream and downstream procurement technology. My personal definition and what we've adopted at Spend Matters when we think of upstream is areas around strategic decision making, around analysis, around measuring types of performance, sourcing, for example, upstream, spend analysis upstream. We think of downstream more as the execution of spend. Again, our definition and not others. But there's differences here. And when it comes to P2P, there's some great lessons learned. So upstream activities touch fewer individuals, really by an order of magnitude. Really, it's the procurement organization in many cases. Maybe it's finance. Maybe it's getting into other groups. But downstream, we've got far more users touching the system, and integration needs to be absolutely front and center. We also need to look at these activities, whether they're upstream or downstream, from a business perspective versus an IT one. Now, we still have IT organizations getting involved in certain types of procurement decisions, for example, looking at supplier master data management, internal master data management, but we've got to think about the business user versus IT necessarily stepping in. Another major lesson learned here is that we need to treat these categories as we would from a sourcing standpoint. We don't have vertical integration in many industries for a smart reason, right? It ran its course during the Henry Ford era. It made sense to have certain degrees of vertical integration, but there's a reason we get our servers from somebody else who sells us our database, who sells us the web server, who sells us our sourcing tool, our e-procurement tool, our spend analysis tool. Specialization counts. And here, a major lesson learned was going to one source necessarily is not always the best solution early on. And a lot of companies, many of whom still have ERP, e-procurement systems, maybe they're happy with them now, have learned to surround them with third-party tools because they get much more value that way. So let's talk about the black hole. Why did it happen? The joke up here I have, thinking back 7 or 8 years, is 21 clicks to buy a paper clip. Literally, in some tool sets early on, it did take 21 clicks to buy a paper clip. We had one Gartner analyst at the time refer to one piece of e-procurement software as the most oversold shelfware on the market. There was another analyst at the time, and I remember this because I was in the vendor community for a short period then, published an expose on why e-procurement adoption was so low. I won't read through the rest of this, but it was a bad time thinking back to 2001, 2002, even through 2003, 2004. And that resulted in what I'll call the buying black hole, really that giant sucking sound, which is a lack of buying compliance. We invested a fortune in these systems, at least most of us did, with inside the Fortune 500 or Global 2000, but we didn't get the results we were after. we had that sucking sound of a lack of compliance and our dollars going into solutions which didn't necessarily give the value we thought they would. But the good news is if we flash forward to today, the dark days ended rather quickly. I mean, unbelievable. In less than, a dog's lifetime, we've got many solutions in the market which can provide significant value, are much easier to implement, which put the user first. We've got lots of solutions as well which enable suppliers to be more effective in terms of presenting their wares, their catalog information, and the like. And companies are getting excited again about procurement technologies. Again, we had this period for years where we prioritized other types of investments, sourcing, spend analysis, contract management. Compliance was something hard to do, especially when it came to standard indirect procurement. But now there's a real focus on putting the user first. And that, to me, looking at this market as somebody who's lived through all of it over the years, is absolutely key. If somebody came to me in the mid-'90s and said, SAP, Oracle, Ariba, Commerce One, i2, whomever it was, it's all about the user, I would have laughed. Now everybody's talking about the user. Now people are addressing it in different ways, but putting the user first is so key here. So let's talk about the right approaches for today, and we'll transition to guided buying in this discussion. So how do we escape the gravitational pull of this buying black hole? The first piece and element I would suggest here is to focus on the user first, right? This is almost a given. But what's important to understand here is that all elements of that user interface matter. It's not just a question of, shopping across a set of catalogs and doing cross-comparison. It's not just a question, of looking for past activity, copying a shopping cart, kitting and bundling, to enable similar purchase in the future. There's so many elements of the UI, and we'll talk about some of these later, and you'll see some examples later in the presentation as well. With the UI as well and the user, it's important not to ignore the possibility of guided buying either. I'll talk about two definitions of this in a little while. I'll talk about mine. I'll talk about a colleague of mine as well who's been using this term for about a decade. And then you'll hear the Zycus view of guided buying as well. Some other beliefs we have include the importance of augmenting, but not necessarily replacing, technology too. This is a key. I've been involved in a lot of selections recently where folks haven't necessarily frozen an ERP backend. Maybe they're going through an upgrade process, but they want to surround it with third-party tools to get more value from it. We think you can amplify the ROI of these existing investments versus necessarily ripping and replacing. You might freeze the investment in them. You might invest in other solutions alongside them or on the front end, but it is possible to get more from what you've spent already. And then we can also put certain things into a box as well, and we can decide to address them later, or we can surround them entirely. So, let's talk about how we can banish this black hole for good and what it means for different stakeholders and users. It's important to realize that procurement alone is not only the beneficiary of better P2P systems, right? From a procurement standpoint, there's lots of benefits. Probably the most important of which goes unstated, but we all know, is that if we have a system which requires compliance and usage because it works, people buy less. If they're being monitored and they can't get around it, they're going to buy less. We can actually reduce spending. At the same time, obviously, we can drive better behavior. We can drive spend to preferred suppliers. We can make sure we're getting the warranties and given items we need. We can make sure that we're consolidating spend across the ideal set of vendors. Lots of benefits of compliance on the P2P side. We can also think about this from a line of business perspective, though, those frontline users. We can make procurement transparent. We can make shifting from that home purchase on iTunes or Amazon at 6:30 in the morning to buying a new notebook computer or buying a toner cartridge or buying a peripheral for a mobile device in the office at 8:15 when somebody comes in. Transparent, it can be just as easy. 10 years ago, somebody would have laughed at you if you said Amazon and our buying system in the office would be the same. But they don't have to be that different anymore in terms of that user experience. There's lots of benefits for other folks in the company as well. HR, especially on the services procurement side, whether it's contingent labor or whether it's more advanced categories. If we can drive folks to make better decisions, we can improve the onboarding and compliance process. We can drive better talent and business outcomes, whether that is for a basic contingent worker or whether it's for a consulting project or a systems implementation project. We can drive better outcomes and value. Significant benefits for AP, finance, treasury as well. If we have a P2P system in place, that can become the groundwork for looking at working capital management strategies and discounting strategies. Sure, you can do 210 net 30 anytime, but good luck implementing it without a system which can drive to more than a handful of suppliers. And then last, we can make IT look good in all of this too if we can escape from the black hole. We can make the existing investments they've already spent provide that much more value in terms of the value to procurement and the business. So what do we have to do? We would argue focusing on the basics first is key. So taking inventory of what you have already, what systems and tools you have, what do you want to achieve? It's important to understand as well, we can work alongside existing IT upgrade schedules, right? If Oracle and SAP are, almost religious icons in our company, we can still work alongside that. But we need to know what is going to happen and what is coming down the pike. We need to prioritize specific initiatives. Are we after investing in P2P from a compliance perspective first? Are we after savings and working capital goals as well through closing the loop on the back end and being able to affect successful payment term changes or discounting for that matter, where a third party could get involved in helping fund it if we don't want to use our balance sheet? We can still profit from it. We need to conduct a business gap analysis around our current needs and future needs. And then a technical and product gap analysis as well. These are the basics, right? When building a business plan and after building a business plan, these are the things you have to do first around P2P in our view. Now, having said that, we see 5 primary strategies. If you have a system in place, any type of system, whether it's just an ERP backend on the direct side, or whether you might have an indirect system already as well, but perhaps you're not getting the results you want. We see 5 surround strategies which companies can take. I'm going to go through each of these in detail on the coming slides, so won't go through this on this slide here. The first strategy of these 5 is to focus on the user experience first. We think this is absolutely fundamental. We think putting a new experience layer on top of existing systems, or as we deploy new ones, which creates a usability buffer between the complexity on the back end. For example, a frontline user doesn't have to know based on a volume threshold, based on a category, whatever it is they're buying, that the workflow approval is going to be very different, or that we might be tracking them in different ways. We just need to make that experience on the front end transparent, so on the back end, things can get done, but the frontline user knows exactly what it is they're up to. We'll talk more about this in a bit, but we can also guide buyers to make better decisions as well from a front-end perspective. So we can literally lead them down a path to drive compliance or drive a buying outcome. The next strategy is to augment from the core. And here we see the option of augmenting existing e-procurement and P2P investments versus necessarily throwing them out. This is more and more common. I've been involved in multiple discussions in the past month and one formal selection where it's about augmentation. It's not about replacing, it's about augmenting. And there's different areas to focus on in doing this. You can focus on supplier enablement. You can focus literally on the frontline user as well, as a focus. You can focus on connectivity for supplier information or catalog information. You can focus on plumbing. We talk a lot about the e-invoicing world and the plumbing necessary when you're onboarding potentially hundreds of suppliers with different systems to push POs back and forth, invoices, ship notifications, and the like. But plumbing is quite important here. We can also look at ways of driving better outcomes through augmenting at the core by focusing on peripheral spend areas like T&E as well. So significant opportunity looking at what we have already and how do we build around it. The next strategy we see is what we call complementary add-ons. So really investing in technology that goes above what we originally purchased. Some of these add-ons could focus on services procurement. It's a major one we often see. It could also focus, though, on enabling organizations to manage a broader portion of their indirect, often catalog spend, or complicated services without a VMS tool set through an e-procurement front end. So lots of opportunities to think about these complementary add-ons as a core P2P strategy. The fourth strategy we would argue here is to think more than just technology, right? So think about BPO-like offerings for the hosting and management of technology. So there are some providers who don't own their IP necessarily, but they can provide a lot of services around it. Or they own IP, but it's very specialized. This could be just around supplier onboarding, for example. It could be a supplier network, which literally just manages the exchange of transactional data. It could be enabling more effective outcomes based on information around corporate social responsibility, green information. It could be around reuse programs and scrap programs. So thinking beyond just the platform itself and thinking about providers who can offer content intelligence, hosting value-added services around it as well, or something others don't do in just foundational technology alone. The last strategy we're seeing more and more companies think about ties back to this whole black hole metaphor, but this is a positive black hole. This is about consuming your host. So in this strategy, we see perhaps existing investments within P2P, but the results haven't been what was originally thought would occur. So what we have is these surround investments, whether it's a front-end system, whether it's a services procurement system sitting on top, whether it's really any other kind of system on the periphery, but over time, that becomes our system. And we don't set out to necessarily replace the old system at first, or at least state that as the goal, but it's exactly what the goal is. So we're going to surround it to a point where it's completely marginalized and we don't need it anymore. So the notion here, obviously, is not of swapping out the solutions immediately, but it's a dual deployment approach. But we do have the end goal in mind of consuming the host. So a few final thoughts before I turn it over to Orville or to Richard Waugh in a minute here. I want to talk about this concept of guided buying. I'm quoting a piece on Spend Matters from the original architect of the concept itself, Pierre Mitchell. Pierre is now at Hackett Group and is one of the researchers I looked up to the most in the space and has been for over a decade. Pierre used to be at AMR Research, and he wrote a brief originally on this concept of guided buying at least a decade ago. And he contributed to Spend Matters recently with an update on his thinking on the importance of guiding users to the best possible front-end decision through a procurement tool set. And different suggestions here from him in terms of how we do it. Most importantly, we've got to create an intuitive and compelling front-end experience. So it's more than just a drive-by in terms of using a tool set for the first time and hoping for a given outcome. We've also got to guide the person who's making a decision to what they're after. So when they come in for the first time, they get results. They get intelligence built into the tool set, which can steer them in a given direction. And we can ultimately guide them to what we're calling preferred supply here in Pierre's words. But what is preferred supply? So it could be preferred suppliers, right? Thinking about what products and services we can buy from whom and to whom. It's not just an approved supplier list, though, but it's a preferred list, and this is the key. And we can overlay a set of specific business rules based on category, dollar amount, supplier items. It's about preferred buyer pay channels, as Pierre calls it, which is to say the workflow and supporting systems around it. And it's about supply beyond the catalog. So certainly, catalogs have their place, and there are some great content and catalog management tool sets out there. And there are some proxy tools which can work alongside them around search as well and the user experience in shopping. But there are also numerous suppliers by which we're not going to use a catalog. So how to, beyond the catalog, how do we enable a similar compliance and buying experience? So just a few final thoughts from Pierre on the topic. One of the keys here is automating the upfront process and helping guide the user and determine that upfront requirement. We've got to think about as well, stepping back for a minute and looking at lessons from the consumer world. What makes Google so valuable here in Pierre's analysis, and we would concur, is not just the UI, but it's what lies underneath it. So as you type into Google and it gets better results for you based on what you've done in the past, based on your geography, based on whether or not you're logging on via iOS, on a mobile device or a desktop. It guides us to a better search outcome. Perfect analogy for driving to a better buying outcome. Some final thoughts here. It's important not to forget the buying basics as well as we think about a guided buying approach. We need a place to keep our contracts, to manage our categories and taxonomy. We've got to think about workflow, how we manage tactical buying, right? Or above a certain amount, are we going to go to a minimum of 3 bids versus just putting it through the e-procurement toolset alone? But all of these concepts are absolutely critical. So a few lessons learned before I close here, escaping from the P2P and buying black hole. There's many approaches to doing this. There's not one answer. One size never fits all when it comes to pushing forward and getting out of the gravitational pull as well. We can think about building on what we've done or implemented already. We can learn from past mistakes and programs too. A lot of providers, namely the ERPs and some of the large specialist vendors, have gotten much better in the past decade. But still, oftentimes, you need to augment some of their capability at the periphery if you're going down that path. Benchmarking is key as well. Understand how you stack up today versus where you need to go. And last, if you're going to pursue something creative, maybe it's tackling complex services through an e-procurement tool set, look for creative approaches and from vendors or from suppliers is probably a nicer way to put it, but vendors, as we call them on the technology side. Oftentimes, we need a new type of solution partner who's more creative. And last, I'll close with just a handful of recommendations here. Understand the you are here dot up front. We talked about that already at the beginning. Take stock of what you have and where you are. Decide what types of models you want to embrace. Are we going to surround existing implementations? Are we going to consume our host? Are we going to start anew? We've got to think about the business case for adoption. And we've got to prioritize the needs of the frontline user. We also recommend using specialist providers as a cornerstone of any strategy focused on usability. Now, it's important to note here, and we would be remiss in saying that the larger providers are not thinking about usability. They are, and SAP and Ariba separately are actually releasing on their different products new UIs in the coming 12 months. But specialty providers have been the cornerstone to date of new types of usability approaches. And remember, it's not just the search bar. It's not just how things look. It's what occurs behind it and the architecture. We've got to go deep where we need to. And last, number 7, we should think about pursuing incremental and measurable returns from the start. What you're about to see from Richard as well is some examples of guided buying in process. And I would urge you to think about the impact on your organization when it comes to steering users to make better decisions. This is not something we've thought about historically in P2P. It's been about compliance. It's been about making sure we drive folks onto the right channel, but truly driving them to better outcomes each time, making their life easier, but also driving to a better outcome is core to what Pierre initially termed or phrased guided buying. Something I'm excited about. It's early going, but worth hearing out this new approach and seeing it in more detail now. So with that, I'm going to hand it over. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Jason, for that insightful overview of the buying black hole challenges that are faced by many first-generation P2P adopters, as well as the opportunities available with next-generation solutions. Now, in our view, those challenges have tended to focus on 3 major gaps that together make first-generation P2P the 50% solution, meaning most of those who have adopted these solutions are only halfway towards achieving the key performance improvements that they originally targeted. So taking the 3 major gaps, first, compliance, and the most obvious gap being the inability to achieve full spend coverage with P2P solutions originally designed to address only standard products that conform to the typical catalog model, largely ignoring services or non-standard product spend that constitutes the majority of total indirect spending targeted for P2P compliance. Process compliance as well is an often overlooked yet no less significant gap. First, many first-generation e-procurement solutions were really procure-to-order processes, not encompassing the full P2P cycle by enabling order delivery, supplier invoicing, and settlement to close the loop. Second, solutions which relied on free-form requisitions for off-catalog purchases left end users to their own devices when they were requesting more complex, non-catalog items, actually creating more opportunities for maverick spend with other than preferred vendors, or at the very least inaccurately categorized and coded spend transactions that don't follow the correct approval process and obscure spend analysis efforts on the back end. Second gap, usability, and the stakes are never higher than with P2P. Here you can make the claim that the usability footprint is larger than almost any other enterprise application, including ERP, in that almost any employee in the organization could or should be at least an occasional shopper or approver in the P2P system. Here, non-intuitive enterprise-type UIs, typical of Gen 1 solutions, have resulted in most organizations plateauing from an adoption standpoint at only about 50% of the number of internal users or suppliers that they originally targeted. Now, as Jason points out, user interface and experience have moved to the top of the P2P selection criteria model, and the universal refrain is that the B2B user experience needs to mimic the B2C model exemplified by consumer sites such as Amazon. The third gap then, ROI. Business case projections that were predicated on achieving full spend coverage and user adoption predictably fall short of the expectations when the first two goals are not met. And that leaves us with the opportunity for next generation P2P adopters to close the gap where it matters the most, return on investment. At this point, I'd like to introduce one of the first poll questions where we'd like to survey our audience today and bring John back in to tee up the poll that we'd like to talk about here with which of the Gen 1 P2P gaps represent your biggest challenges.
Thank you, Richard. As Richard said, our first poll question today asks, as Richard mentioned, which of the Gen 1 P2P gaps is your biggest challenge? Your choices are A, compliance, B, usability, C, ROI, and D, none of the above. And we'll give you a couple moments to make your selection before closing the poll and discussing the results.
Right, and again, John, we talked about compliance on a couple of different dimensions, spend and process. We talked about usability, and certainly Jason hit that point home, focus on the user first. And to some extent, we talked about ROI sort of being the byproduct of those two. If you solve the challenge one, compliance, and challenge two, usability, you're certainly well along the way towards achieving those ROI targets.
Absolutely. All right, we'll close the poll, and I don't think it should be too much of a surprise that compliance is the highest rated challenge.
I think I agree, John, and I think certainly we probably have a procurement-centric audience too, for whom compliance is a major focus, and of course, end users may not realize that compliance is always the end game, and for them, it starts with usability. But I think in many respects, these three pillars or three challenges are all pulling in the same direction. So good insights from those poll results. I thought I'd just shed a little bit more light on the magnitude of the spend compliance challenge. And most organizations really look no further than indirect services to uncover a major compliance blind spot. This indirect spend breakdown provided by the Hackett Group shows that categories which are primarily services account for almost half of total indirect spending by themselves. And those would include things like corporate professional services, logistics, marketing, and travel. But when you add in services-related spend in primarily product categories, so for instance, equipment or facilities maintenance in MRO, IT, or capital categories, the total services spend actually accounts for almost two-thirds of total indirect spending for the typical organization. And the blind spot for Gen 1 P2P systems has been the reliance on free-form requisitions to address these non-catalogable items and the non-compliance that results for the majority of indirect spending. Poll question number 2 then, at this point, just to get a sense from the audience out there, to estimate approximately how much indirect spending would they say is non-catalogable, that being services or non-standard products. So the choices here, 60% or more for A, 40 to 60% for B, 20 to 40% C, and less than 20% D. And again, John, we're rapidly tabulating results.
We are.
And I think we're seeing a pretty good distribution, across those where certainly the majority, the vast majority, are going to be, better. But we're right about 50% right now that are above 40% of total spend that they would classify as non-catalogable. So a very significant opportunity to address through P2P systems in a smarter way than we've done in the past, as I said, predominantly free-form requisitioning. So again, good illumination from the poll results. And to talk then about how we at Zycus are specifically addressing those gaps and really introducing some significant innovation to the market in terms of a next-generation P2P system. Think about a metaphor that we've applied here, a GPS for P2P. So in this case, a guided procurement system. In much the same way that a GPS helps each of us navigate unfamiliar surroundings, the guided procurement system, or guided buying, introduces a new level of usability and compliance by guiding end users through this process. So at any point, they can click on the icon that says Guide Me and be directed to the right supplier, the right category, et cetera. And the way that we're doing that, we're leveraging patented artificial intelligence-based technology to automatically classify that end user search to the correct industry standard category, applying the appropriate UNSPSC, the United Nations Standard Product and Services category, that corresponds to that user's keyword search term. And as stated in the quote here from Pierre Mitchell at Hackett, who's been referenced earlier in Jason's presentation, this removes the guesswork for the end user by automatically suggesting not only the correct category and allowing the user to confirm it, but also automating and simplifying the rest of the process for that end user. So they're automatically presented with a category-specific E-form, or G-form, as we like to call them in the guided buying model for a guided form, and that helps them specify the unique attributes and other requirements for the item, be it service or product, that they're requesting, instead of staring at a blank free-form requisition screen and guessing what the right category or the right GL code or the right vendor might be. And that G form then automatically directs the user only to those approved vendor, to the approved vendor or vendors for that category, and it initiates the appropriate category-specific workflow and applies the correct GL account coding upon checkout. No additional user intervention required. And as noted by Pierre, this makes guided procurement more than a slick consumer-like UI, but a powerful compliance tool as well. So to bring this GPS for P2P metaphor to life, I'd like to walk you through a brief usability scenario and demonstrate the user experience with the aid of guided buying. First maybe to start from a home page for an end user, and this would be configurable to that specific end user in the organization. First of all, it would be branded with the organization's logo and color scheme, but then also the category structure that's presented to the user would be based on their specific permissions and access as to which categories and which supplier catalogs they have access to. And they can then search that that repository, this marketplace in a number of different ways, whichever they happen to be most comfortable with, either browsing through categories or simply doing a keyword search. So a category-based search might take me first to a listing of, again, standard industry categories and subcategories for them to select from, and I simply browse through those, get a set of search results that allow me to compare products from multiple vendors, filter the results according to manufacturer, supplier, price range, whatever I happen to be interested in, and quickly narrow in and hone in on the right selection, even allowing me to select items for a side-by-side product comparison before I put the item in my shopping cart. So these would be standard catalogable items, maybe a somewhat familiar, again, Amazon-like search. But the magnitude of the challenge with P2P is how do I address that almost two-thirds of spend that's non-catalogable, non-product related services spend in other categories. And this is where guided buying really shines. So in this case, I might be looking for cleaning and janitorial services, and in a Web 2.0 type interface with type-ahead capability, I'm automatically presented with the relevant and appropriate category choices for cleaning and janitorial services. And at that point, I'm also presented with a specific G form, or again, our version of an E form, that corresponds to that category. So I don't have to think about all the attributes and specifications that I need to requisition an item such as cleaning and janitorial services. Instead, I'm taken through kind of a wizard-like interface where I'm presented with the choices about what are the locations, what is the square footage, what is the frequency of the service that I require, and oh, by the way, at the end, I'm presented only with those approved vendors from whom I should be buying this type of service. So again, instead of a completely blank slate or a free form that opens the door to users picking non-approved vendors or picking the wrong category, picking the wrong GL accounts, all this is specified for the user, simplified for the user to make that process much easier for them. And when I get to checkout, I've got a multi-item, multi-vendor shopping cart. And again, the process has been significantly streamlined. The user can preview what the workflow will be, where that requisition will get routed before it gets approved. And that workflow process, the buy-pay channel, as described in the quote from Pierre, is predetermined. It's in a category-specific way based on what I selected from an approved vendor. The appropriate workflow will take over. There will be an automatic mapping from the category to the correct GL account code, taking that guesswork out of the process for the end user. So now we've seen how guided buying simplifies the user experience and drives greater compliance at the same time by making it much easier for users to do the right thing. And this helps close those first-generation P2P gaps, the first two gaps being compliance and usability. And now the payoff comes from closing the ROI gap. As Jason said earlier, there's truth in numbers, and he advised procurement organizations to always measure themselves against external benchmarks to gauge current performance levels and identify opportunities. In looking across the key P2P performance metrics compiled here from Aberdeen Group benchmarks, it's clear that there's a pronounced gap between most of the market, that being average performers and the laggards that trail the overall market, and those achieving best-in-class results. And the potential ROI improvement from closing those gaps is extremely compelling. So, for instance, improving spend compliance by placing as much as 50% more indirect spend on contract produces an average savings of 12% for every additional or incremental dollar of on-contract spend. Or speeding up ordering and invoice processing cycles by up to 85% to reduce transaction costs and take advantage of early payment discounts or e-commerce or P-card rebates offered by suppliers. And ultimately, eliminating or reducing the stubbornly high dollar amount and volume of spend transactions that continue to occur as off-catalog requisitions that don't comply with approved vendor contracts, don't follow the appropriate approval process, are misclassified and miscoded, or happen outside of the P2P system altogether. So for our final poll question, I wanted to get a sense, now that folks have kind of taken in the state of P2P these days and the buying black hole that was created in Gen 1 and some of the new opportunities in the next generation P2P solutions, the question here is, for your organization, what are your plans in terms of deploying a Procure-to-Pay solution or augmenting an existing Procure-to-Pay solution? A, is that something you're looking to do immediately? B, within the next quarter or so, 3 months down the line? C, 6 months down the line or more? And, finally, it's just not in the plans right now, D. So we'll let the results tabulate here. So, quite a few folks looking at doing something in the very near term, but still a significant portion that's not currently in the plans. And there could be a variety of reasons for that. Partly that putting the plan in place takes time and effort, too, to really put together the strategies, the approaches, et cetera. So, John, some interesting results here.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I kind of mentioned the planning process. So if it's not planned currently, one of the things that we've undertaken as an effort is to help simplify that planning process. So many of the tools to develop the plan for next generation P2P solutions to help close those gaps in P2P compliance, usability, and ROI achievement are available in our new P2P playbook that covers these topics: benchmarking, business case analysis, that adoption focus both in terms of users and suppliers, designing a compliant process from the start, and prioritizing the plan within the context of the future state and how P2P integrates across the entire source-to-pay continuum. And that's all available for any of our audience that would like to get a free copy of this simply by emailing us at webcast@zycus.com. And, John, that concludes my portion. I'd like to turn it back to you at this stage.
All right. Thank you so much, Richard. We provided the contact information for Jason, Richard, and Akshay Modi from Zycus, so please reach out to them if you have any further questions. At this time, we are ready to address your questions. To send in a question or comment, click New Question on the tab below the slides. Type in your question and click Send. Be sure to click New Question for each new question or comment you wish to share. Questions will be addressed verbally as time allows, and your submitted questions are visible only to the presenters. Let's start with a question that came in during the presentation. Richard, this one is for you. Can the system flag preferred vendors?
Oh, yeah. We talked a lot about compliance and driving to preferred vendors, and there are a number of ways that the system can do that. First, it can identify where there's a differentiation between, there may be some between preferred or contracted vendors to further prioritize those that are the most preferred. And then there are a number of other flags that can be designated around the type of vendor. So that could be a minority women-owned business that has a preference in a category, or green vendors or green products that can be flagged right in the search results to, again, to Jason's point, affect better buying outcomes, not just compliance, but better outcomes in the process.
All right, thank you. Jason, this one is for you. What should I do if I have existing P2P investments and want to investigate the notion of guided buying? And where do I start?
I would say first and foremost, the most important thing is to kind of step back to the middle of my presentation and talk about where are you in terms of what you have today, and what are your goals, the goals of your IT organization and others. If we've gone down an ERP-centric path, for example, and SAP, or Oracle or PeopleSoft is the religion, And from a core backend perspective, we're not going to deviate from that. There are tools. Richard mentioned one of them. There are others as well, which can enable you to, drive that guided experience for the possibly not the selection of a given supplier or type of service, but at least classification of the type of category you want to, and whether you're using UNSPSC or some type of customized taxonomy or a different one, actually categorize correctly in the context of the buying experience. So if you're going down that ERP path and you're not going to deviate, there are still tools out there which are available. If you're more flexible, even if you are ERP-centric, but you're willing to surround the implementation in its totality and put on a new front end, it greatly opens up the world of possibility around different providers to work with, and different outcomes and philosophies. How far do you want to take the guided buying experience? Is it not just about the classification, but is it about steering folks to the right set of suppliers, letting them know about a given outcome? The place this whole concept started in practice, kind of ironically, even though Pierre came up with the phrase, was actually some vendor management systems on the contingent workforce side around staffing decisions. Now with Zycus and others, we've seen this notion put forth to broader indirect and broader services categories as well. So to step back, though, it really is based on what you have. And based on how much leeway you have to truly surround the implementation and what the end goals are.
All right, thank you, Jason. Richard, this one's for you. Can guided form templates be customized to our requirements?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. And we've actually preloaded our system with over 500 of these guided forms that were configured based on, us having analyzed trillions of dollars in spend. So really understanding what those category specifications and attributes are to streamline the process for end users. But then an organization can take those templates and then customize them to their unique requirements, resave them, and share them. So they got a great starting point with 500 preloaded. They can customize them and create new ones of their own. So it really is a great leap forward, as I said, from the days of anything that wasn't on catalog is now a blank free form, and it's a free-for-all in many respects.
All right, thank you, Richard. Thank you to our attendees for their great questions, and to Jason and Richard for a terrific presentation. Attendees of today's event will receive an email from ISM within 10 business days with links to your Continuing Education Hour certificate and the archived interactive recording of today's event. For these secure links to work, you must be logged into ISM's website at www.ism.ws. Log in near the top of the screen in the shaded gray boxes. Please use the username and password that you normally use on the ISM site. If you can't recall what those are, select the Forgot My Password link at the top right below the shaded boxes and follow the instructions. If you haven't set up a username and password, click the Create an Account link below the shaded boxes to do so. You'll need to enter your ISM ID number. Contact ISM Customer Service at 800-888-6276, option 8, for questions about your ISM ID number. After you are logged in, the link sent in the ISM post-event email will work, and you will be able to retrieve your documents. Save your ISM.ws username and password for future events and to interact on ISM's website. I'll turn it back to you, Kurt.
Thank you so much, John, and that does conclude today's presentation, The Buying Black Hole, Closing P2P Compliance and Usability Gaps, brought to you by the Institute for Supply Management and sponsored by Zycus. Thanks to our presenters, Jason Bush and Richard Waugh, and our moderator, John Uva. We do hope you enjoyed the presentation. As a reminder, we ask you to take a moment and complete the evaluation that will be appearing momentarily. Please stay connected. Your comments and suggestions are important as it helps us provide you with future quality programming. Today's program is copyrighted in 2012 by the Institute for Supply Management, all rights reserved. The Omnovia connection will close and you will be taken to the evaluation. Thank you for joining us today and enjoy the rest of your day.